The Emancipation Proclamation, or Proclamation 95, was a presidential proclamation and executive order issued by United States President Abraham Lincoln on September 22, 1862, during the Civil War.
Background:
Military action prior to emancipation. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required individuals to return runaway slaves to their owners. During the war, Union generals such as Benjamin Butler declared that slaves in occupied areas were contraband of war and accordingly refused to return them. This decision was controversial because it implied recognition of the Confederacy as a separate, independent sovereign state under international law, a notion that Lincoln steadfastly denied. As a result, he did not promote the contraband designation. In addition, as contraband, these people were legally designated as property when they crossed Union lines and their ultimate status was uncertain. Governmental action toward emancipation. In December 1861, Lincoln sent his first annual message to Congress. In it he praised the free labor system as respecting human rights over property rights. In January 1862, Thaddeus Stevens called for total war against the rebellion to include emancipation of slaves, arguing that, by forcing the loss of enslaved labor, would ruin the rebel economy. On March 13, 1862, Congress approved a law enacting an additional article of war, forbidding Union Army officers to return fugitive slaves to their owners. Slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia on April 16, 1862, and on June 19, Congress prohibited slavery in all United States territories, though not in the states. In July, the Confiscation Act of 1862 contained provisions for court proceedings to liberate slaves held by convicted rebels, or slaves of rebels that had escaped to Union lines.
Public opinion of emancipation.
In the summer of 1862, Republican editor Horace Greeley wrote a famous editorial entitled "The Prayer of 20 Millions," demanding to Lincoln a faster emancipation of the slaves. Lincoln's reply would become famous. "What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because it helps to save the Union." Historian Richard Striner argues that for years Lincoln's letter has been misread as Lincoln only wanted to save the Union. He says that Lincoln was softening the strong Northern white supremacist opposition to his imminent emancipation. Since slavery was protected by the Constitution, the only way that he could free the slaves was as a tactic of war. Conflicting advice, to free all slaves, or not free them at all, was presented to Lincoln in public and private. A mass rally in Chicago on September 7, 1862, demanded immediate and universal emancipation of slaves. Even used as a war power, emancipation was a risky political act. Public opinion as a whole was against it.
Drafting and issuance of the proclamation.
Lincoln drafted his preliminary proclamation and read it to Secretary of State William Seward and Secretary of Navy Gideon Welles on July 13th. Seward advised Lincoln to issue the proclamation after a major Union victory, or else it would appear as if the Union was giving its last shriek of retreat. In September 1862, the Battle of Antietam gave Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after Antietam occurred, and while living at the Soldiers' Home, Lincoln called his cabinet into session and issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The final proclamation was issued on January 1, 1863. Although implicitly granted authority by Congress, Lincoln used his powers as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy as a necessary war measure as the basis of the proclamation, rather than the equivalent of a statute enacted by Congress or a constitutional amendment.
Immediate and political impact.
It has been inaccurately claimed that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave. Historian Lerone Bennett Jr. alleged that the proclamation was designed not to free any slaves. However, as a result of the proclamation, many slaves were freed during the course of the war, beginning with the day it took effect. Emancipation was immediately enforced as Union soldiers advanced into the Confederacy. Slaves fled their masters and were often assisted by Union soldiers. Robert E. Lee saw the proclamation as a way for the Union to bolster the number of soldiers it could place on the field, making it imperative for the Confederacy to increase their own numbers. The proclamation was immediately denounced by Copperhead Democrats who opposed the war and advocated restoring the Union by allowing slavery. They cast the proclamation as a call for slaves to commit extreme acts of violence on all white Southerners and saw it as an unconstitutional abuse of presidential power. War Democrats who rejected the Copperhead position within their party found themselves in a quandary. While throughout the war they had continued to espouse the racist positions of their party, they did see the proclamation as a viable military tool against the South. The question would continue to trouble them and eventually lead to a split within their party as the war progressed.
Confederate response.
The Confederate response was one of expected outrage. The proclamation was seen as a proof that Lincoln would have abolished slavery even if the states had remained in the Union. The South professed to be very angry, and less than a year after the law's passage, the Confederates massacred black U.S. soldiers at Fort Pillow. However, some Confederates welcomed the proclamation, as they believed it would strengthen pro-slavery sentiment in the Confederacy and, thus, lead to greater enlistment of white men into the Confederate Army. Even some Union soldiers concurred with this view and expressed reservations about the proclamation. Not on principle, but rather because they were afraid it would increase the Confederacy's determination to fight on and maintain slavery.
The ending of slavery.
Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in November 1863 made indirect reference to the proclamation and the ending of slavery as a war goal with the phrase "New Birth of Freedom." The proclamation solidified Lincoln's support among the rapidly growing abolitionist element of the Republican Party and ensured that they would not block his renomination in 1864.